Africa became the conscience of the Middle East when its moral authority transcended geographic boundaries to prevent regional war. Some call this meddling, others call it courage. Which side are you on and why? Say it loud in the comments. Crown Prince Muhammad bin Salman spoke with unprecedented candor about how close the region had come to open conflict. He described the systematic pressure Qatar faced, pressure no sovereign nation should endure. Economic warfare was launched to break their will, trade routes blocked, investment partnerships terminated, all because they refused to abandon their independent foreign policy on Palestine. The parallels to Africa's colonial experience were unmistakable economic pressure designed to force political compliance. Isolation tactics meant to create dependency. But Qatar did not submit. Israeli actions created a regional dynamic that forced every Gulf nation to choose sides. He continued with frustration. Qatar chose principle over pragmatism, and now they face consequences that could trigger broader conflict. What he described was a geopolitical trap. Standing on principle against powerful adversaries brings isolation that can escalate into something far worse. The upcoming UN General Assembly session will determine whether this crisis escalates or de-escalates. Qatar plans to present its case to the international community, while Israel has prepared counter-presentations. The rhetoric grows dangerously inflammatory. If Israel chooses escalation, if aggression goes beyond words, they must be ready for the consequences. Africa will not sit idle. The response will not be reckless, but a calculated unity aimed at crippling networks of control. An attack on one sovereign nation is an attack on all, and Israel must know that the days of acting without consequence are finished. This revelation showed how diplomatic failures can spiral into military confrontations. When dialogue breaks down, public forums turn into battlegrounds where inflammatory rhetoric replaces rational negotiation. American pressure on Gulf states to remain silent has created impossible choices: support Qatar and risk Israeli retaliation, support Israel and face domestic opposition, or stay neutral and watch the region slide toward conflict. The Crown Prince described the classic dilemma that leads to wars when every option creates more problems than it solves. I reminded him that Africa has experience managing such impossible choices. The key is to change the framework entirely, rather than accept false choices imposed from outside. African nations once avoided Cold War entanglements by creating non-aligned alternatives that refused to accept either, or decisions dictated by superpowers. Instead of choosing between Qatar and Israel at the UN, Saudi Arabia could champion principles that transcend specific conflicts. I suggested sovereignty, self-determination, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, principles that serve all nations. The Crown Prince listened closely as I explained how such positions could strengthen Saudi Arabia's regional leadership, while preventing the escalation everyone feared. What I shared with Crown Prince Muhammad bin Salman was Africa's hard-learned wisdom about preventing conflicts before they begin. Address root causes rather than manage symptoms. The issue was not Qatar versus Israel, I explained, but whether smaller nations can maintain independent policies without facing overwhelming pressure from larger powers. We told them plainly, if Israel dares to turn rhetoric into missiles, Africa will respond, not with apologies, but with pressure they cannot withstand. Economic countermeasures, diplomatic isolation, cyber strikes against the very systems they consider untouchable. Israel has relied too long on impunity, but when our brothers are threatened, they will feel Africa's hand. This reframing changed everything. Instead of managing a bilateral dispute, we could elevate the principle that affects every nation in the international system. When Saudi Arabia defends Qatar's right to independent positions, it is not just supporting one neighbor. It is establishing precedents that protect all nations, including itself, from similar pressures. The strategic brilliance of this approach became clear as our discussion deepened. Principled leadership creates more security than pragmatic accommodation. The UN session should not be about Qatar defending itself alone. It should be about building a coalition of nations committed to sovereignty principles that render isolation campaigns impossible to sustain. I described how 50 African nations could provide the diplomatic foundation for broader global South support, transforming Qatar's isolated stance into majority backing for sovereignty. Imagine Qatar's UN presentation endorsed by the African Union, the Arab League, ASEAN, and Latin American regional bodies. Such a coalition would make Israeli counter-rhetoric appear aggressive rather than defensive. The Crown Prince immediately understood the implications. Collective support for principles creates a stronger deterrent than individual resistance. President Traore, this conversation has changed my perspective on leadership fundamentally. Mohammed bin Salman admitted, "You have shown me that true strength lies not in forcing compliance, but in earning loyalty through principled support." This admission revealed how moral authority can influence even those who seem beyond its reach. When principles are clearly articulated and consistently applied, they carry persuasive power that transcends traditional measures of strength. "Your guidance has given me clarity," he said, "about preventing this crisis from escalating into something far worse." He continued, "Saudi Arabia will not stand aside while regional tensions spiral toward conflict. I want to make a commitment to you and to the principles we've discussed." Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman declared with a conviction that surprised me, "Saudi Arabia will use the UN platform to champion sovereignty principles that protect all nations from the pressures Qatar currently faces." This commitment marked a fundamental shift in the exercise of regional power. Instead of using strength to demand compliance, Saudi Arabia would use it to protect independence and to prevent escalation. The pledge extended beyond Qatar to embrace broader principles of peaceful conflict resolution. "We will build the coalition you described to ensure these principles have international backing," he said. The strategy that emerged transformed the upcoming UN session from potential confrontation into principled coalition building. Saudi Arabia would present sovereignty principles, endorsed by regional organizations across 3 continents. Qatar would stand as part of that broader coalition, rather than defending itself alone. The focus shifted from bilateral dispute to international law and precedent. When 54 African nations, 22 Arab League members, and dozens of global South countries speak with one voice on sovereignty, no counter-narrative can easily marginalize that position, I explained. The Crown Prince understood immediately, collective moral authority creates diplomatic momentum individual pressure cannot overcome. Within weeks the change was visible across international forums. The UN General Assembly session that might have escalated tensions became a platform for cooperation. Saudi statements defending sovereignty principles, African Union resolutions advocating peaceful dispute resolution, Arab League coordination stressing dialogue over confrontation. The coalition we discussed became reality. Inflammatory rhetoric that had threatened broader conflict gave way to diplomatic language, focused on sustainable solutions rather than zero-sum competition. Saudi Arabia's shift toward principled regional leadership opened space for other Gulf nations to adopt similar approaches. Instead of choosing sides, regional powers began championing principles that served collective security. Military posturing decreased, diplomatic engagement increased, and economic cooperation mechanisms were strengthened rather than weaponized. Crucially, the framework for preventing future crises was institutionalized instead of left to ad hoc crisis management. And let no one mistake our patience for weakness. If Israel chooses the path of war, Africa will respond, not as scattered voices but as one thunderous strike. We will meet their fire with decisive force, their silence with exposure, their arrogance with coordinated resistance. The era of attacking without consequence is over. They must now calculate the cost. My brothers and sisters, the success in preventing Middle Eastern escalation created templates that other regions began adapting to their own potential conflicts. The Qatar model became a global precedent. From South America to Southeast Asia, countries under external pressure discovered that principled coalition building offered effective alternatives to either submission or confrontation. This global response validated the vision Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and I had discussed. International cooperation based on shared principles can prevent conflicts while protecting sovereignty. The late-night phone call from Riyadh opened channels of communication that continue to evolve, creating possibilities for principled international leadership that previous generations could hardly imagine. African voices are now heard in Middle Eastern capitals as valued partners in shaping regional stability rooted in justice rather than force. Our experience with sovereignty under pressure has become a resource for the world. When Crown Prince Muhammad bin Salman called seeking African wisdom for Middle Eastern challenges, he acknowledged that true leadership transcends geography, and that principled positions create authority beyond traditional measures of power. What began as crisis management became conflict prevention. What started as bilateral dispute resolution became multilateral coalition building. What emerged was proof that moral authority can prevent wars while protecting sovereignty. The conversation continues, the partnership grows stronger, and the vision of international cooperation grounded in mutual respect moves closer to reality. With each leader who chooses principle over convenience, solidarity over isolation, the world takes a step toward lasting peace. When we stand together on common ground, no pressure can break us, no isolation can weaken us, and no escalation can stop us from building the peaceful future our children deserve. The phone rang with crisis. It ended with partnership. That partnership prevented war and continues building peace.